Hi everyone, delonewolf here, and welcome back to EVE Talk, your weekly look at the market in EVE Online. And on the news front, don't really have that much. I didn't keep too close of an eye on the news. I do know that Plex for Good has ended and that the EVE Online player base gathered over $500,000 for the Plex for Good drive for Ukraine. So really awesome, by far the largest Plex for Good drive so far. Alright, let's just dive in, and I don't have any real news, and so my full focus at the moment is what's coming for FanFest, and I think I'm not alone on that. So my general expectation as well is that the market will be in a little bit of a wait and see pattern, because well, it all really depends on what CCP announces next. First FanFest in a couple of years, so hopefully we get a lot of cool stuff. First of all, let's take a quick look at the New Eden store. I did see a lot of sales and things like that on the website and even in my mailbox, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, here on the skins front, don't really see anything there. Let's go straight to the services. Those are just the packages, so we don't have any special sales happening at the moment in the New Eden store. All right, then we get to move on straight to the market. We will start with some Plex and stuff that's coming in at 130. Like that, and let's get started and let's see if I'm right on this. So first of all, we get the Plex prices in Jeddah back below 3.1 million, buyers just above 2.9 million, and I think we'll see a little bit of a pullback on this one. Yeah, exactly. So we did have a bit of a top here formed above 3 million for the average price, not too sustainable for the market. And of course we get the explanation as well in the opening of the video. We got a little bit of extra, or at least a decent amount of extra demand for the Plex for Good drive. So this full pullback is actually pretty normal. If we take a look at the prices outside of the player-owned trade hubs, at least the sellers definitely in competition, right, just below 3.1 million, and the buyers are not doing too much here either. 2.9 million is basically the current Plex price, averages between 2.9 and 3.0 million. So basically we are, in my opinion, finding our new equilibrium at around this range, and so my expectation is that we'll start to move pretty much sideways going towards a FanFest. Next up, we get the multiple pilot train certificate, also stalling the recovery, trying to get back above 1.3 billion, doing so a little bit on a Plex drive, but after that falling back and basically still slowly seeing a little bit of upward pressure on the 20-day moving average. Volume starting to pick up here as well. I do think that they're still relatively cheap in that we have a little bit of volume to absorb here, but it's a pretty slow process for this tiny market. 1.3 billion now for the sellers and above 1.2 billion for the buyers. Still a bit of a low margin. I think we'll have these sellers slowly edge up. That seems to be the trend. Skill extractors next, same pattern of course as the Plex prices, and you can see here the probably the Plex drive, maybe some other stuff as well, causing a plateau at the 1-year high point, and so we're losing a little bit of ground on that one. Back down below 350 million for most sellers, 350 million in Jeddah actually, and then 335 million for the buyers, both in Jeddah and in the Tranquility Trading Tower. Quite a bit of competition. That's 15 million and below of margin on something that costs 300 plus million. That's a very, very tiny margin. So we do see strong demand. I think strong enough demand that here we'll see, in my opinion, the same pattern, that will just start to stall, start to move sideways, and it really all depends on what CCP announces for FanFest. The impact on these skill injectors, I think those were under pressure, and all right, we see a first real reversal here after breaking below the 630 million mark on the chart. The market said we're gonna start to do something else, and we shot up back to 650 million ISK, 651 for the sellers, 620 for the buyers, 30 million margin, again really pretty damn narrow, showing that upwards pressure is at least partly due to pretty strong demand. I think this is pretty interesting. Not really sure where it comes from. It does look like 630 was like, all right, let's dive back into this market. Maybe this could be preparation for FanFest as well. Who knows what comes there? We know that CCP has actually come out with quite a few changes that did require new skills like the compression technology, and so maybe investing, getting ready for potentially some really cool stuff that requires skill points. Could be an interesting move, of course. Let's see if the small scale injector can buck that trend. No, you can see here massive buying. Went below 135 million, back above 140 million. That's a pretty sharp increase for about 10 days. 132 million though for the sellers, 136 for most, and 120 million for the buyers. So that's really still, in my opinion, means that this is something that's not completely right. This is probably your 135 or something like that. Alright, the daily alpha injectors next, starting to move sideways at a pretty high point, well above 45 million. I do think there is still pretty strong demand for this. 48 million for the sellers, 40 million for the buyers. That's a decent margin, actually, about 20%. That 8 million margin between sellers and buyers. You can see supply is not that high. Demand is decently strong, but nothing too crazy actually here either. So kind of interesting. Although the volumes are doing decent on the seller side in and around JITA, we are starting to see actually a pretty small market for daily alpha injectors. This, in my opinion, is pretty dangerous. You can see the margin has opened up, but if this drought, you could say, keeps going, then the alpha injector could shoot up to even higher prices. Of course, we do know that CCP has changed the philosophy when it comes to sales and events and things like that to being willing to intervene in the sandbox. We've seen that right here in the daily alpha injector. Would be interesting to see what happens if we push up above 50 million for these daily alpha injectors, at least on the sell side, perhaps even on the average prices if CCP decides to do something about that. Then we've got the hypercore market that's back up as well, back up of 330,000 is definitely the high point here at the moment as well. 320,000 for most sellers, 308,000 for the buyers, but a little bit of action in the last 24 hours must have put a little bit of pressure, which is also normal. Of course, you do get your best sell opportunity in quite a while. I think I'm still holding some hypercores as well from the very initial gift that CCP did when they first introduced the Hypernet Relay. So overall, pretty expensive, maybe a little bit of inflation expectation being built in here as well, although there's clearly a bit of move here as well on the higher volumes. It's just in the last couple of days I was first going to link that maybe to Plex for good, right? More use of the Hypernet Relay to get liquid ISK and thus to turn that into Plex and then, go help the Plex for good drive this way. But yeah, it's a little bit late here. We do have a push in volumes and in price just in the last couple of days. So not really sure what's happening there. Feels like maybe some inflation expectation. Next up, the mineral market coming in at 755. There we go. As always, we start with titanium, and you can see that it's not good news. After touching 4 ISK, we did have a little bit of a bounce. Player saying, hey, that seems like it's pretty damn low. Let's try to buy the cheapest stuff. But the 20-day moving average just keeps moving down, and we're again at the 4 ISK average range at the moment. 4.15 for the sellers in JITA, 4.10 for the Tranquility Trading Tower. We do generally go for the JITA view, considering that the volumes here are clearly dominating. 390 for the buyers. I'm not sure if we can really push through that. It's a 700 million volume order, but if we get through that, you can see 380 comes into view pretty damn quickly, and I would not be surprised that enough volumes will come in to actually make that happen, with maybe a couple of bounces that need to work its way through that big buy volume. But overall, we are seeing continued pressure in the titanium market, heading towards a new equilibrium that's way lower, probably around the 4 ISK mark. Pyrite is suffering from the same thing, and that's really not good news, going straight through the 10 ISK barrier. Trying to hesitate a little bit right here, a little bit of buying and maybe selling as well at around the 10 ISK as people or traders decide on their positions, but the trend is just not stoppable, and we are now at 9 ISK for the sellers, 877 for the buyers, starting to get really narrow here. But as I've said before, those psychological barriers, right? We tried to defend them, just couldn't do it. We could actually really head towards a 9, maybe even 775, something like that for Pyrite. I'm just guessing that maybe even the new focus that CCP has on the newer players has brought in quite a bit of HiSec mining, and of course what can you bring in relatively safely from the security of HiSec? It is Tritanium, it is Pyrite, and it is Mixalon. So these first two clearly under pressure, clearly oversupplied. It could also be a sign that there's less production happening at the moment. We will see, but let's see what Mixalon is doing then, and starting to lose a little bit of ground here as well, back below 75 ISK for the week. 72 for the sellers, 68 for the buyers, still a narrow margin. Volume wise it's a little bit less worrying, 10 million, 16 million, those are like the bigger orders. That's actually quite normal, but the pressure is on. HiSec minerals are clearly starting to be a little bit of a problem if you're looking for a value proposition. I'm starting to think that maybe this will also stall the Isogen trend that has been up for the last couple of months at this point, but nope. All right, a little bit of surprise, but we're pushing 300 ISK. We really are starting to chew through those reserves, and I think more and more we will start to play with that dynamic of active supply, active demand. I mean, 300 ISK compared to 50 ISK about a year ago. That is a 6x on the price. That's huge. 300 ISK compared to like 1300, 1400 ISK for Noxium is also starting to, in my opinion, be a somewhat reasonable price for Isogen, especially considering the 70-75 range for Mixalon. All of this is starting to feel a lot more normal, but we do get another rip up to 300 ISK here on the chart. So sellers are coming in at 330, buyers are forced up to 275, and look at these volumes, way more in line with what you would expect. 30-20 million, those are the really big ones, maybe even old reserves amongst them, but less than 10 million for most sell orders are definitely maybe a couple of million could even become the new normal. And then we have to start to scroll back down to 600 ISK for another 200 million, but this is really starting to me to look like a drying up of those old reserves. We get a couple of small orders or large orders, 20-30 million, but that is actually absorbable by the markets, and there's probably even speculators that will be willing to buy at these prices in order to have those Isogen reserves and maybe even sell them later down the line at even higher price. So I do think that those reserve holders will start to actually think maybe I shouldn't put that much on the market. Holding on will start to dominate the psychology, and also there will be more of them, people that want those Isogen reserves now for the even longer future, not for this sell opportunity right now. So I would not be surprised if here we start to go above the 300, but that we would then start to see a little bit of upwards, downwards, depending on active supply and active demands. But I mean, I've been calling for it for a very, very long time, but here it is, another rip up to 300 ISK on the chart, sellers at 330. Very, very expensive Isogen, of course, and for those that have a lot of patience and are still holding on to some Isogen, like myself, this to me starts to feel like the time when maybe you will want to look into selling, but be smart about it, put in small volumes, don't spook the market too much. But I think it will happen. You know, it's almost inevitable that someone is going to come in and say, I get another 50 million lying around, here it is, push the price back down a little bit. But that also, I think, will be the indication that we're starting the price discovery phase, and that we're gonna get pretty close to that point where, you know, selling, buying, active supply, active demand is going to start to play a bigger role than just we're starting to chew through those old reserves. Then we've got the Noxium chart that's actually seeing a little bit of pressure, but from a pretty high price point. So this is still quite reasonable. 1350 for the sellers, 1300 for the buyers. So a little bit less margin. We get a 10 million units order that's coming in here only on a 1 week. On a 1 week though, that's interesting. It could definitely be that here we have players that are saying like, all right, 1343, I've got quite a bit of Noxium, let's see if we can actually sell that. But I'm not afraid of getting 8 million, a couple million back from that quantity, just to see what happens later down the line, and maybe sell it at 14 plus or something like that. And you can see everything else on the volumes is below a million. 2 million is really the highest range for Noxium, and so if we'll go back to that Isogen chart, yeah, couple million, maybe below 10 million, like a couple of those standout orders, but you can see that those volumes are way closer to one another. So it's really interesting to see this dynamic. Obviously, I don't expect Isogen to go to above 1,000 discs, but that new equilibrium price is still a little bit of a mystery to me. I do think that this rip up here is going to start to show that volatility and that price discovery phase. Next up, we've got Zydrine that is plateauing, but yeah, at the price of well above 1,000 discs. So that new price range here is being set, if I'm not mistaken, by the importing or exporting entities, so the nullsec players. 1150 for the sellers, 1100 for the buyers. Really narrow margin. You see exactly who is dominating the price, and here is the big difference. You do have 2.7 million, 2 million, 2 million here coming in. This shows that it's larger groups, it's more organization, they're able to sell in bigger batches, and what that's going to do is of course help with stability, which is exactly the pattern that we're seeing here. Megasite then also plateauing at that new price point, 1000 disc for the sellers, 940 for the buyers, and here we actually do see smaller volumes and I think a little bit more price pressure from these smaller volumes, and this is kind of normal as well if you accept the premise that Megasite is not purely dominated by nullsec, but there are other sources of Megasite like the Triglavian space where eventually that finds its way into the market even in small volumes, but maybe a little bit more willing to cut down on the price in order to sell quickly, and so you get this Megasite that's less expensive than Zydrine. And finally we get the Morphite chart that is also stalling the descent here, but we've been here before at 50k, at what's this one right here, below 45k, so now we get another potential bottom, but who knows how long that's going to take. 43,000 for the sellers, 39,000 for the buyers, so let's call it a 40k new potential bottom. I personally do think that this one has a better chance of becoming the bottom, and the main reason for that is that the max potential of Morphite will have been on the table from day one, from the double availability that happened here in December. But I think that we've completely matured that, because we've seen in advanced movements that increased potential is starting to show up there as well. So there's no reason to go after even more Morphite. In all likeliness, everything that can be mined is being mined, and thus we got a new price discovery, and it's in advanced movements that we're getting the crash at the moment and the sustained pressure. So overall, the picture here for mining is not that great for those that want that easy, steady income. In nullsec, you're dominated by the groups that basically have a monopoly on them. In highsec, we're being oversupplied quite massively, so if you want a real return, you're gonna have to risk it in lowsec, which is of course pretty risky, but you can see that at the moment you are getting a better and better reward for those efforts as well. Next up, the PI market, that's coming in at 1755. There we go. Let's get started on this one. Here I am expecting the holding pattern, honestly. I don't think I saw any announcements on the blueprint changes that CCP is working on, so maybe we'll get those only a little bit before FanFest. If CCP holds the pattern from the last couple of FanFest, then we should get dev blogs and announcements and lots of information in the weeks coming up to FanFest, so that we can discuss everything out in the open at FanFest itself. Hopefully we get a cool live stream and lots of announcements, but at the moment, yeah, my expectation is that that's where we'll get some blueprint information, and until then there will be some position taken, which is this volatility here. But now I do think most players will have done that, and so broadcast nodes indeed are pretty much sideways at the current range, 1.6 to 1.4 million. Basically a little bit below the August highs, but definitely expecting more potential demand. I think if you're back to being able to make dreadnought caches, then that could definitely cause increased demand here if CCP doesn't only touch PI, of course. Then we get construction blocks, very interesting, able to climb to 9,000 disc all of a sudden. 8.7 for most sellers, but we go towards 9,000 disc pretty quickly here at 9.4, and then we get 8.250, 8.260 for the buyers. So construction blocks still pretty strong and actually making its way to a 1-year high point. Consumer electronics though doing the opposite trend, back to 6,000 ISK, 6.6 for the sellers, 6,000 ISK for the buyers. I think here we're basically suffering from a little bit too much supply compared to the demand, so the demand is not uniform across all of the PI segments, and we do still have some differences here. I thought we'd move more sideways, but no, we actually have quite a bit of movement. Let's see if coolants at least move somewhat sideways. All right, settling at 10,000 ISK, historically normal price, 10k for the sellers, 9.7 for the buyers. Pretty narrow margin here, so showing that strong demand is still here at the moment. Clearly some pressure. I think that this is also pretty normal. Why would you make construction blocks, consumer electronics, when you can just make coolants, which is on gas planets, and that nets you 20, 30, 40% more than those other goods. So there is going to be a little bit of a move, I think, into that production. Cryoprotected solutions are finally coming down from that high point at 150,000. Real sell opportunity, 50% profit on those that follow Eve Talk, and where I told you guys to consider buying this if you want to be ready for some implant stuff. Well, here is or was your sell opportunity. We're still at 130, which is still quite expensive, 126 to 120,000 for the buyers. Again, narrow margin, showing that there is stronger demand across the board in, well, not across the board, but in most PI segments at the moment. And I'm not really sure why we're still stuck at the 130 mark, but maybe it's just a general feeling that we should get ready for whatever comes next. And who knows, cryoprotected solutions, right? There is still a bit of production getting ready, maybe even the new mining ships that require new implants and things like that, or sustaining higher demand than what we had about a year ago, 6 months ago. Then we get enriched uranium tied to fuels, managed to break out as well to what I would call an historically normal peak as well. So this was almost 15k, which was expensive, is very expensive now, was expensive back in the day as well. So we are recovering from that on a little bit more supply. 11,000 for the sellers, 10,560 for the buyers. Again, surprisingly narrow margin between sellers and buyers, but historically speaking, a normal price, I would say, for enriched uranium, back to being more expensive than coolants. Our integrity response drones are still seeing more pressure, back below 1.5 million, but sellers are at 1.6 and buyers at 1.4. And now I need to sneeze. Oh, excuse me for that. Yeah, a bit of margin opening up here, not really sure. Looks like demand just dropped off a little bit, but overall still a decent price range for integrity response drones. Then we get our mechanical parts that are trying to get back to 10k yet again. 9.5 for the sellers, 9.140 for the buyers. Again, really narrow margin. We're used to 1,000 disc in margin between sellers and buyers in these refined PI materials. Not yet 10k, but mechanical parts like coolants, very easy to make on barren planets. So overall, I feel like, you know, PI materials, at least the refined PI materials tied to fuels, have regained their former glory. 10k for most of these, and even enriched uranium managed to become the more expensive one, which is normal because you need a far more rare planet type in order to build it on a single planet. Then we've got our nanites next that are still climbing up slowly, hesitantly, but we are clearly going towards higher average prices. 6.130 for the sellers, 5.3 for the buyers. That's the one big difference here, a far more normal margin between sellers and buyers, which I think is why we've got this volatility, this hesitation on these average prices. Nano factories next, after peaking to 1.5 million, even 2 million on a daily average, not sustainable, so we crashed back down to 750,000, but that was a little bit too much too quickly as well. We're back at around 1 million, yeah, 1 million for the sellers, 850,000 for the buyers, so here back to an above average price actually for nano factories. Organic mortar applicators continuing slow pressure, back below 700,000 here, 660 to less than 500,000 for the buyers. So clearly players are expecting potentially organic mortar applicators to become a losing segment of the changes to the blueprints, which I think there are differences depending on the types of ships and the types of advanced PI materials. So this is all, if you would dive into the potential details or in the current details of blueprints and of production cycles, I think that would explain a lot. Then we get the recursive computing module. One more month, guys. Right around FanFest, this should be gone and we should get a better chart. But we're staying above $1 million, so that's not that bad. 1.1 for the sellers, 900,000 for the buyers. That's a pretty wide margin here yet again. Let's see if robotics can climb. No, still stuck below 70,000 ISK. 69 to 67,000. The narrow margin is right back tied to PI materials. Very narrow margin showing strong demand, but historically speaking, this is still like 30% below the normal price, whereas coolants, etc., have recovered that historical perspective. Self-harmonizing power cores next also had a peak to 2 million, but falling back down quickly on plenty of supplies. I'm expecting 1.3 million for the buyers as well. So we are hitting a bottom. We could bounce back a little bit, maybe to the 1.5 or something like that. But clearly, this was a little bit too much speculatively speaking. Plenty of self-harmonizing power cores out there willing to take advantage of better prices. Serial conduit, same thing right here, went to 1.25 and is falling back down. So way more volatility than I expected, honestly. Back below $1 million for the sellers, less than 900,000 for the buyers. Yeah, I thought we'd be more in a wait and see pattern, but clearly players are taking gambles and needing PI across the board, showing volatility, higher prices here and there as well. Very interesting. Ukami superconductors back to the high range, 80k. On not enough availability, and buyers forced up to 71,000. Hopefully we can start an upward trend here as well. And then we get wetware mainframes that are basically still below average, 1.4 million for the sellers and below 1.3 million for the buyers. So a bit of a surprise to me. I thought we'd start to move a little bit more sideways, but no, clearly in advanced PI, in refined PI, we get different trends, like downtrends here, uptrends here. But we get volatility, we get markets moving, we get sometimes oversupply, sometimes a lot of demand, very strong demand with super narrow margins. So it's really across the board, a lot of stuff happening in PI with, I would say, a surprising amount of volatility this close to announcements and FanFest. I thought more players would basically be ready, and I thought that more players like myself would still hold quite large reserves to take advantage of a lot of these better prices. I'm still holding a decent chunk of coolants, a decent chunk of mechanical parts and things like that that would basically crush a lot of these upwards movements quite effectively. But no, average prices are sticking around and sometimes even going higher. Next up, advanced boom mats, but first a quick blow of my nose and a little bit of drinking. It is surprisingly cold for the first days of April here in Belgium. So hopefully I don't catch a cold or anything like that. But let's get started. Advanced boom mats coming in at 27.30. And there we go. As always, we start with the carbides. And are we going through 100 ISK? So that's really the danger, of course, of the increased availability, the doubling of the resources across the board. And we are 94 for the sellers, 88 for the buyers. I think 6 months ago, we would never thought that something like this would happen. But here we are, finally. The changes to mining and the increased potential for mining is starting to take shape, and after more fight, it is advanced boom mats that are basically on a roller coaster down, and who knows where that's going to stop. Next up, we've got next carbide is titanium for Caldari, also going below 100 ISK, 95 for the sellers, 83 for the buyers. And then we've got Fernite carbide for Minmatar, also below 100, 104 still for the sellers, 95 for the buyers. But look at those average prices. So people are dumping right now to those buyers. They're saying you're willing to pay 95 for Fernite carbide. Here you go, get as much of it as you want. So very risky to make large investments on this already. Then we got tungsten carbide. That's our exception, Amar related, 124 for the sellers, 116 for the buyers. So this is actually starting to become a massive crash. If we compare some of these losing, well, more than 50%, more than half the value from a year ago, and on the downside that's quite substantial. And the danger here, you could say, is that of course this mining potential and this lower return on that mining that happens now with moon mining will eventually spill over into other areas, but low sec is very dangerous, and so we could even see more spillover into high sec, and that actually may be what's happening now that I think about it. Let me know in the comments what you think about this theory, but the very first thing where, of course, the full potential of the doubling of the availability was felt was in Morphite, since that was so crazy expensive. That was, of course, the first rush, but the next gold rush was the nullsec entities and other entities, of course in HiSec as well, focusing their efforts on moon mining, where availability was doubled as well, and we're seeing the impact on this here. But now these prices are starting to become so low that maybe a lot of that is starting to spill over into HiSec as well, which is under pressure, and just because there's so much more of it, players are starting to take full advantage of all of the new mining changes. They are finding the ways to get the full potential out of a mining fleet, and this is the result. Availability is definitely back. So players that were basically worried that that we were still in a scarcity phase, this actually starts to indicate that we are clearly getting into a new phase for the economy, at least for the most raw of resources. Let's see what's happening in the meta materials. Next here are photonic metamaterials, also breaking down below 10k, 1 year low point here, less than 9,000 for the sellers, 8.2 for the buyers. Clearly a trend break here as well. Then we got non-linear metamaterials, same story here, 1 year low point, still a little bit higher, 16,000 to 15,000, but it's Caldari, so there are differences probably in the meta that are explaining these different demands, price points and or equilibrium price points. And then we get the next one, which is plasmonic metamaterials. Not yet at a 1 year low point. We've been here in the last month or so, but clearly we're trading very low here as well. And goddammit, I keep clicking on something that I shouldn't, but 14.5 for the sellers, 14,000 for the buyers. And then finally we get terahertz metamaterials that is touching 12.5 here as well, back at the low point, 12.7 for the sellers, 12,000 for the buyers. And you can see there's not a lot of buyers in the market anymore. So oversupply is starting to spill over, and this could eventually lead to cheaper ships, which at the moment it's all about Tick 2 with the advanced moon mats. But if this trend continues in minerals as well, it is definitely pretty interesting to see all of that mining potential that is starting to be brought to the market and its impact on price. So for the other advanced movements, I'm not expecting good news. There we go. Fermionic condensates did have a last hurrah, right, at the change from February to March, going back to 80k on the average 5-day moving average, even 100,000 for a day here. But then the response comes, the supply comes in, and we're back at a 1 year low point below 50,000 ISK. Yeah, 47,750 for the sellers, 46,850 for the buyers. Ferrogel, a little bit of a bounce, but from a very pronounced 1 year low point going below 25,000 ISK. Next we've got Fullerite dropping off a cliff below 500 ISK. I mean 1,012.50, very easy range that it managed to maintain for a very long time, and now just 50% gone again. Less than 500 for the sellers, 440 for the buyers. Hypersynaptic fibers, 1 year low point. We're just going to go through these a little bit more quickly here. The trend is clear. 3,000 ISK for nano transistors. Phenolic composites basically still hovering at that 1,000 ISK here, trying to support it, but how long will that last? Pressurized oxidizers, so the new ones are a little bit of an exception, still above 10,000 ISK on this one. Reinforced carbon fiber, almost a year old, but are we below 10k? Yeah, look at that, 9.9 for the sellers, 9.5 for the buyers. And then we get our ceramic fibers, 1-year low point now below 200 ISK. So advanced moon materials pretty much across the board under massive pressure, 1-year low points, very large availability compared to the demand that exists out there, and all of that should put pressure on at least some prices as well, which I think we'll see right away in the Tick 2 ship market at 34.00. Let's do that. And let's just dive right in here, because I have been saying that I was always looking for the cheapest prices over the last probably even year or so at this point, that I was not looking to actively trade, but rather looking for buying cheap so that hopefully later down the line we can buy better. But at this point we gotta become more and more careful of that, because of course we're seeing what's happening in the advanced moon materials, and I honestly would need to see a real bottom forming there before I jump in massively into Tech 2 ships at this point. If I were to take a gamble now, I would go Tech 3 and hope that CCP buffs or changes all Tech 3 cruisers. That would be my real trade gamble of the moment. But now for Tech 2, I'd basically buy what I personally I want to use myself, for instance. So here is the Basilisk, clearly starting to move in that lower range, hovering above 150. 172,000 for the sellers, 156,000 for the buyers. What I did not expect, but what is interesting here is that we're touching 150 twice at this point, and that we did manage to go up to 200 million at the high point. Very difficult to do, but this is actually a doable trade. So let's keep one eye out for a little bit of volatility, and then try to find that new bottom. It could be 150 on the chart for the Basilisk. Of course, we'll have to keep an eye on it. Next up here we get the Cerberus, and this one just broke through the 150 million for a heavy assault cruiser. 147 million for the sellers, 135 for the buyers. So here it's a real gamble to take, but maybe you could try to buy a Cerberus and then hope that a little bit of volatility comes in. But as I've said, it feels very risky considering what else is happening in the markets. Then we get the Guardian starting to hover around that new 160 million average range. 160 for the sellers, 143 million for the buyers. Definitely pretty low, with again that 150 coming into play as potentially, if the chart gets close to that, risk a buy order well below that, and then try to sell at a higher price towards that maybe 180 high point. It is perhaps possible. We'll have to see. It's probably still a little bit early to call that our new range for these cruisers. Let's see what the covered ups are doing. Here is the Hound. We went well below 20 million, and I did mention here we're so much below the chart that that's something that might be riskable. Especially because, of course, it's only 20 million. It's quite different from everything else. And here we go, shooting back up to 23.4 million, still below 20 million for the buyers. But you probably have a small sell opportunity here. The one warning, though, is that CCP did announce we're going to buff stealth bombers. They're going to be able to throw bombs more quickly. That might not be enough, but it clearly does show that CCP understands massively buffing the HP and potential of battleships does mean that their counter stealth bombers might need to be looked at as well, and so this might just be the start, and so perhaps a speculative trade is starting to happen around the stealth bombers, hoping that a CCP intervention will mean a profit. The Ikitursa cannot buck the trend. We're still well below 600 million for the average prices, 640 million for the sellers, one coming at 580 and 545 million for the buyers, so very large margin here. Clearly, cheaper prices seem to exist from Triglavian space as well. The Ishtar reaching 1-year low point, again the 150 million coming into play for a cruiser, 151 for the sellers, 141 million for the buyers. It's going to be interesting to see if we do get a bounce from this range. Then we get the Manticore, surprisingly stable despite everything that's happening, of course at a pretty low range. 24 million for the sellers, 20 million for the buyers. Buyers just completely evaporating from the market, but we're not seeing a crash in the price. So if the chart would go to 20 million, you might look at a buy opportunity, but for the moment it's very difficult to say what the Manticore is doing. Then the Munin landing on the 150 as well. There we go, again for a cruiser. Kind of interesting. Sellers coming in at 155, buyers at 137 million for a Munin. And then we get the Nemesis, another 1 year low point. This starts to be potentially interesting as well. 18 million for the sellers, lots of supply, not a lot of demand, coming in at 16 million, well below the price of a Hound, of a Manticore. If I were to take a gamble, right, it's less than 20 million a ship. A couple of Nemesis stealth bombers would definitely be on my radar. Then we get the Oneros, just breaking through that 130. 150 coming in at a 130 million as potentially its low end, 130 for the sellers, 128 for the buyers. Then the Panther, can that one resist? Still above a billion, bit surprised by that. 1 billion for the sellers, a billion for the buyers. The Purifier is also doing a bit of like the Hound, went below 20 million and is back at 25. That's actually tradable, 26 million for the sellers, still below 20 for the buyers. But if you manage to grab some on this downtrend well below 20 million, you get a small sell opportunity. That again gives me a little bit of hope for the Nemesis. Then we get the Scimitar, 1 year low point, actually heading towards the 130 here as well. Not good news for Basilisk, Cerberus and things like that. 140 for the sellers, 120 for the buyers. The Widow still staying at the billion. I'm really surprised how these battleships are holding on. A billion to 940,000. And finally the Zealot also stabilizing at 160. So I'd be very careful here. Potentially I can see the Zealot break down to 150 as well, like most of the other cruisers. So the Tech 2 ship market, very, very risky, a lot of pressure, and we're clearly seeing why in the advanced moon mats market. I would say stealth bombers though look interesting, especially this week. The Nemesis, the Hound and the Purifier are starting to show a little bit of volatility, and we know that they are on the radar for CCP considering what they've done for the battleship. So if I were to decide on trying a trade for Tech 2 ships, it would be the Nemesis for me this week. And last week I mentioned, I think I definitely mentioned the Hound. I think I mentioned the Purifier as well. But there you go, small trade opportunity that is starting to show up here. So interesting, very, very interesting. And we will of course keep an eye on all of that. But for now, clearly the cheaper stuff, the increased availability, is starting to make Tech 2 ships very cheap. Next up, the Tech 3 ships at 41.10. Or 15 actually. Let's do 41.15. All right, let's start with these destroyers. Here is the Confessor, back at 50 million. I think we didn't have that much supply last week. Still not that much, 2 in the last 24 hours. Everything else at 51.5 million. Basically quite a bit older. Bars at 46 million. So a surprisingly low amount of supply is keeping us decently stable, but back above 50 million. Then we get the Hecate that did go up last week, but is stabilizing well above 50 million here as well. 53 for the sellers, 47 for the buyers. Supply in the last 24 hours also non-existent. Very interesting here too. The ranges though are quite similar to the Confessor. And then we get a Jackdaw. Here we should see the supply. We went up to almost 60 million ISK. We're starting to come down, but it's really struggling. That's very, very surprising. Still just below 55 million on today's average. 55 million for the sellers, 50 million for the buyers. And look at that, it's not even half a page of new supply. It is 40-ish ships, so that is a decent amount, trying to take advantage of these better prices. I'm kind of wondering if the potential here has gone down. That because it's only 3 ships that are basically intertwined in their market, that it's all a little bit trickier, bulkier for some reason. So we get not that many Jackdaws, trying to bring the price back down from 60 million. By far, of course, last week this was the most expensive, or does the best to sell tactical destroyer. But I'm really surprised to see like no ships in the Hecate and the Confessor in response to just 40 Jackdaws trying to take advantage of these better prices. And even the price response is quite muted here. So it's very difficult to exactly know what's happening in this market. But to me, it feels like it's become smaller and that just 40, 50 ships are starting to move the needle here. But that it's also very, very slow. So the range in which prices are willing to shift is pretty low as well. And then we get our Zwepel that is doing the exact opposite, right? All of these you could say they feel 50 plus, right? This feels like it's pretty expensive, and then the Zwepel is down here below 42.5 million, 44 for the sellers, less than 40 million for the buyers. If you're really wanting to do a gamble on a CCP intervention again, we've just seen it in the Proteus where they're willing to go after a single ship that's lagging behind within its segment. Then you could say that might be the same for the Zwepel here, at least price wise. So who knows, if you want a CCP gamble, then I would say buying a couple of Zwepels would make sense. But that's for the longer term. I don't expect a turnaround or a shift without CCP actually announcing something here. For the cruisers, we've got the Legion back above 180. So here, new trend line, 170 buy price potentially, 184 for the sellers, less than 170 for the buyers. So if sellers bring the average price back to 170, I think that should give buyers a little bit of room to go even lower. Buy then and sell when you get above 180. It is potentially tradable. To me, it also feels like this could be the place to be on the tick tree trading market. Then we get to Loki, definitely breaking down, heading towards 180. So we're getting a 192 for the sellers, 174 for the buyers. Honestly, that's a lot of pressure over the last month or so. We're probably in the last days of potentially being able to buy. So if you can buy, let's say below 180, including the taxes, you already have a small trade now. But if we do get a recovery, which I'm expecting, then you do have a decent trade here. Then we've got the Proteus very flat despite the high volumes, which to me is another indication that it's harder now to really completely manipulate the Tech 3 cruiser market, because it's become, more players are probably holding these hulls as well, because you can use them now as well without risking skill points. 185 for the sellers, 180 for the buyers. That's a pretty narrow margin between sellers and buyers here. So despite the volume, really decently stable, slightly higher, but nothing too spectacular. And then we get the Tengu that's also stabilizing here. So 180 towards that on the chart could be a buy range. 193 for the sellers, 181 for the buyers. So at the moment, if you want to take a gamble, a real gamble now has basically switched to the destroyer market. I would go try to buy a couple of vehicles. Would make sense, but admittedly completely as a gamble. And then we've got the both the Legion actually could be something to look into if you want to spend some money that potentially can give you a return in the not too distant future. And then we get the extra product for the week. It's been a while, but I'm actually kind of curious. We've got the Tech 2 ships that are becoming a lot cheaper. 150 million in mind for most of these cruisers. Let's take a look at the faction cruisers next at 46.45. There we go. So we're going towards ships. Then we've got the cruisers, and then we get the faction cruisers. We'll start with the pirate factions. So here is the Eshimu seeing a little bit of pressure, but look at that. 150 million here as well for the average price for a not too popular, in my opinion, and not, although it looks great, I think it's not that powerful, a pirate faction cruiser. 150 for the sellers, 133 for the buyers. So still a little bit cheaper than a Tech 2 heavy assault cruiser, but not by much. And then we get the Cinnabal. Ooh, look at that. 275 million for the sellers, 230 for the buyers. So that's really way more expensive. We're seeing a little bit of pressure here, probably on null-6 stability, meaning that you get more blueprints and things like that, but overall still super expensive. Next, we've got the Ortrus, actually. High point here in November for 500 million ISK for an Ortrus. So we're losing a little bit of ground, but still 335 million for the sellers, 315 for the buyers. This clearly makes them way more expensive than a Tech 2 cruiser. Then we've got the Phantasm, that's 350-ish as well. 335 for the sellers, 286 for the buyers. So losing a little bit. I think supplies are becoming slightly better, but still very expensive. Then we get the Stradios, one of my favorite faction cruisers, 390 million for the sellers, 360 for the buyers. Of course, you get the covered ups, you get all the bonuses for exploration. Incredible cruiser, right? And back in the day, it was like, all right, we'll grab a Stradios, and then maybe we'll go to that all-in-one Ishtar as our next step. But nope, right now you can basically buy 2 Ishtars for the price of a single Stradios. And in my opinion, especially combat-wise and resistance-wise, the Ishtar is actually worth a decent chunk more than the Stradios. Sure, the covered ups and things like that play a role, but it's still just a Tech 1 cruiser basically. Then we've got the Gila that's going for less than 300 million. Definitely not as expensive as most of the others, but 300 for the sellers, 278 for the buyers. More demand, incredible PvE platform as well, admittedly, but still double the price of a Tech 2 cruiser. And then finally we get the Vigilant that's still costing 400 million. Again, a little bit of pressure at the tail end there, but 420 for the sellers, 400 million for the buyers. Is basically very, very rare and super, super expensive. Let's see if the Navy faction cruisers are a little bit better. Here is the Stormbringer. Definitely at the low point for the chart, but 220 million for the sellers, 200 million for the buyers. So still expensive compared to a Tech 2 cruiser. This one is very unique, of course. It is the Eden Com ship with its weapon system. So it's got a niche use, I think, mostly in PvP, honestly, to be that force projector, to be able to do a lot more damage to a lot of clumped up ships. So it's quite unique. Not that expensive at the moment, but still compared to Tech 2 cruiser, again, quite expensive. And then we get the Augur Navy issue right here, 50 million for the sellers, 44 million for the buyers. Interesting, way cheaper. Let's see if the Caracal Navy issue can compete with that. Yep, going for around 50 million as well, 55 for the sellers, 50 million for the buyers. Then we get the Executor Navy issue, 75 million, a little bit more expensive, probably Galente faction warfare related, 80 for the sellers, 73 for the buyers. Then we get the Omen Navy issue, landing on 50 million for Amar, so very cheap at the moment as well, buying for less than 50. Osprey Navy issue, also really cheap on the Caldari side, going for around 50 million. Actually quite a capable platform. I got a couple of videos, I think, with this one showing that it can easily handle the Essential 3 4 out of 10s, missiles, drones, if I'm not mistaken, and a good tank. Let's take a quick look at that. So you get drones, 5 small drones, not bad. I think you get missile launchers in the fittings as well. Not that great, it's only 3 launchers, but it'll get the job done. And then you get 6 medium slots and 4 low slots, so you can definitely get a tank and a little bit of damage in all of that. So it is a great platform, 50-ish million, not that bad. Side fleet issue for Minmatar, a bit more expensive, but on the full 1-year chart still quite affordable as well, 67 million to 50 million. Stabber fleet issue, also a step up, but 75 million is still quite doable. And finally the Vexor Navy issue, if the chart wants to load, also decently affordable, but a step up, 70-ish million. That's quite a bit of surprise. I would say the PvP hulls are more expensive, 50% more expensive, 70-75 million. The PvE hulls, so most Amar Caldari stuff, is 50% cheaper at around 50 million. But so this is a definitely a new way of looking at things. You get pure Tech 1, of course, your step in. Your step 2 is actually faction, Navy faction. After that you get Tech 2, and only after that you get your pirate faction cruisers, some of which are ridiculously expensive at the moment. And that is the new basically value proposition in EVE Online, which doesn't to me make complete sense, because Tech 2 of course does have a massive resistance bonus compared to some of these pirate faction ships, and some of these Navy faction ships like the Caracal Navy issue, in my opinion, has massive potential as well, in both PvE and PvP. It is a super powerful platform, especially now considering the price. So everything is in flux, but I would say that we are seeing the first signs that the end of scarcity is here. How long will it take for more stuff to become affordable, especially the larger ships? That probably will take some CCP intervention and things like that. But overall, a lot of pressure on ship prices at the moment. And there you go. That's going to be it for this EVE Talk. Thank you very much for watching, guys. And as always, I'll see you next time.